Welcome, everyone, to Mercy Week, Day 3. Mercy Week here at St. Joseph's College is our way of honoring our heritage as being founded by the Sisters of Mercy. The sisters have 5 critical concerns, and one of them is anti-racism. And so this year, our Mercy Week has been focusing on this critical concern with a guiding question for each day of the week. Monday, it was, what is systemic racism? Tuesday, it was, what is anti-racism? And tonight, the topic is, what is white privilege? And my guest for the conversation is Debby Irving. Debby is the author of Waking Up White and Finding Myself in the Story of Race. And since the publication of her book, has become a well-known speaker on the topic of whiteness and white privilege around the country, workshops, TED Talks, educational institutions. And so I'm happy to have her with me tonight. And as we have this conversation, if you take a look at your screen, you'll see an email address, vpmission@sjcme.edu. And that's an address that you can send an email question in, and I'll be monitoring the emails as we have our conversation. So Debby, welcome. Welcome to Maine. I know you're familiar with Maine, your family having vacationed here, and you're certainly very familiar with New England because you grew up in New England, correct?
Well, yes, and not only did my family vacation in Maine, my family is from Maine. I'm an
Oh,
outlier to not be
okay,
in Maine. So my family's from Holton, Maine, way up
okay.
on the northern Maine border in Aroostook County.
Oh, okay. Yes, yes. I've not been there, but I certainly I moved here last year from Montana, so I've become slowly familiar
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
with the landscape of Maine. So thank you for joining me for this conversation tonight. And I wanted to start. I think in your book, there's the sentence that I picked up that I think is kind of the thesis of your book. I'm read it to you, and you let me know if you think I'm correct here. You write, understanding whiteness, regardless of class, is key to understanding racism. And it seems to me that your book is kind of your journey of discovery in learning what whiteness is. And what I really enjoyed about the book too was I see it as really a helpful companion to Beverly D'Angelo's white what's her well-known book.
Oh, Robin DiAngelo's
Robin
White
DiAngelo,
Fragility.
yes, Robin
Yeah.
DiAngelo's White Fragility. Her book is, it reads like a professor. It's very straightforward. This is what happens. This is how it works, and this is your place in it. And your book is kind of that journey into it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Almost like a traditional confession, one's journey,
Yes.
recognition of one's shortcomings in a way, and kind of a conversion story along the way. And so your thesis about understanding whiteness, can you kind of unpack that for us? What have you come to understand that to mean when you talk about whiteness?
I think it's important to think about what I thought before I understood whiteness.
Okay, yes.
The way I understood the United States specifically, which is the only place I ever lived, um, was that it was this super special country, the best country in the world. And what we were famous for, according to my understanding, was that we were the free. Anyone could be free here. It was a sweet land of liberty, and that people could come from anywhere, from all over the world, and all they had to do was work hard, pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and they could achieve the American dream. So I bought very deeply into the idea that the playing field was level. The academic term for that is meritocracy, that people make it or don't on their own merit. And so in that mind frame, race and racism, to me, it looked like people here and there, white people here and there who weren't nice to uh, black and brown people. And when I saw when I got out of my white bubble, meaning my childhood, and then my white bubble Kenyon college experience, and I got to the big city of Boston, I started to notice that people lived very differently along racial lines. Neighborhoods looked different. Uh, the way people interacted with me was very different along racial lines. And my only reference point was that the playing field was level and everyone was an individual. And so if people weren't thriving, it must be that person's fault. When I started to understand that the entire United States is a racial caste system and that whiteness is the ideology that drives it, meaning the ancient belief coming out of the Enlightenment period that not all living forms are equal, the natural world is not all equal. There's a hierarchy within the natural world. This is what I bought into. There's a natural order where an ant is below a lion, is below a human. And in the human pile, we're not all equal. There's this white elite male who's cisgender, able-bodied, etc., owning class. Like that's the person who is biologically superior. And if you had asked me, did you buy into these ideas? I would have said, no, we're all equal. I love everybody. It turns out through my exploration that I was very much exposed to whiteness. And I did buy into these ideas of natural order. And I was not aware of the systems, such as the housing and lending systems that favored white people, the distribution of our food supply that favors white, middle class, and above neighborhoods, the fact that the education system is geared towards white students by and for white people, with curriculum that's dominated with the white perspective, history, etc. It wasn't until I really started to understand how the entire world had been organized around a caste system with white upper class men at the top, um, that I started to see myself as something other than a free floating individual, and I started to relate to myself and other people in this bizarre world that I'd bought into, that race was biological, that there was a natural order, only to come to learn, no, there's not. Like that was all constructed for political reasons.
Mhm. And you mentioned that part of this discovery, right, was learning that being white is a race, right? That you have grown, and I mentioned this to you before we started this live stream. My growing up resonates very much with what you described in the book. I grew up in California in the 1970s. I was described a quintessential kind of white suburban kid, lower middle class family probably, but comfortable neighborhood. I walked to all my schools. Um, they were all nearby, within a couple blocks of where I grew up. Um, and I very similarly, I don't know that I thought, I certainly recognized if I had a black friend or if I had an Asian friend. I don't know that I thought of myself in the way they may have thought of me, which was as their white friend, right? And part of your journey of discovery is kind of learning being white is also a race, correct?
Yeah, and it just as must for some people, I just think that must be absurd to think, how did she not know she had a race? And like, I knew to check off white if there was a form to fill out. But I sort of thought that race was the neutral, like the sort of the starting point, and everything else was measured as some deviation from white. And so my language for that is that whiteness was normalized for me. My TV shows were all white. My curriculum was all white. My world looked like Norman Rockwell illustrations. Um, and so that all became very much normalized for me.
Mhm.
So it's like the fish swimming in water. I didn't see the water. I didn't see the whiteness all around me.
Yeah, and this is something I've been thinking about. I'm curious to know in your continued journey with this, if you think some of that has to do with the way by which communities are our forebearers, some of whom at one point when they came to this country were not considered white. If you come
Right.
from Irish or Italian or other backgrounds, who over time, part of their assimilation to this country was in some ways letting go of the Irishness that had been stereotyped, letting go of Italianness that had been stereotyped in some way, and that have we in some ways forgotten those cultures that were once part of our heritage. And so that's how we come to not see white as being a race. I'm just curious to know what you think about that.
Yeah. So you notice when I said it's white, it's male,
Yeah.
it's elite, it's also Anglo.
Mhm.
The French, the Spanish, the English all fought for this new world. It was the English that won. And so Anglo is the dominant, preferred, favored ethnicity. And so there's the term white ethnics that refers to Jews, people who are Polish, Russian, Italian, Greek, people who came to this country not thinking themselves white, thinking themselves, whatever their ethnic roots were. And yet they come to the United States and they're told, if you want to be American, this is what it looks like to assimilate as being an American. And what it means is to become more Anglo. So a lot of times you see people, sometimes Ellis Island, would do it for you, but people voluntarily, including my Irish family, anglicize their names. So it went from O'Doyle to Doyle. And so my father, for instance, was half Catholic, Irish Catholic, half Protestant English, and he completely dropped the Irish Catholicness. We went to a Protestant church. His last name Kittredge is the one that the family adopted, and so we basically kind of passed as full-blown, the best kind of American, the WASP prototype. And I do workshops with companies and schools and churches all over the country, and so many people have a family story exactly what you're saying. That's why my parents, or that's why my grandparents wouldn't let my parents speak Polish. That's why they were forcing them to speak English right away, because it was very important in melting into the melting pot. It meant to be adopt whiteness. And sadly, the other thing that becoming white meant was to look down on people who were not white. It meant buying into the whole racial caste.
It's striking actually to look at, if you look at the era of the great kind of migration from Europe, from Ireland, for example, to see political cartoons that portray the Irish almost like apes. Hairy, and other types of stereotypes, drunken, brawling, and you can imagine then again that, but there's some ideal being held out, to which you could aspire, right? And the kind of social pressure to kind of move from that stereotype toward this ideal that was being kind of laid out for you.
And what's so twisted in that story is that Ireland was conquered and dominated by the English.
Yes.
And the English are telling the rest of the world that Irish are the missing link between apes, black folks, then Irish, then everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the Irish come to what we now call the United States and immediately assimilate in. And which was so important. This is why the word white was invented. It was invented to describe a group of people in the year 1681, in Virginia, as an attempt to divide and conquer the masses. Because at that point, what was going on in the 1600s was a plantation class was forming, was starting to make a lot of money, and working on those plantations. This is at the time where the only group that can own property are these white elite men who have come from Northern European countries. On those plantations are working indigenous people, free blacks, indentured Africans, indentured Europeans, indentured Irish and English people. And so that's the masses. And they started rising up. They started protesting. We want better working conditions. We want the opportunity to own some land. We want higher pay. And there was a series of rebellions. And as a tool to squash those rebellions and regain control, the word white was invented to describe a group of people. And then what that did was it created an immediate underclass of indigenous and African people, particularly African. Black folks were now considered the very bottom of this caste system. And at that point, the plantation class doesn't even consider themselves white. They're kind of above it all. But white people are the group that's going to police the black and brown folks. White people are given the right to report, tattletale on, and to police. White people are given a whole bunch of privileges, protection under the law that black folks are not given. And so that's a really pivotal moment in U.S. history. And from that moment forward, the fight was on who could be white and who couldn't.
And you ask, your book, and each chapter ends with a series of questions for the reader to consider. And I wanted to pose one to you that how would you answer this? How would your previous self have answered this question? And one of the questions you ask is, if you are white and know little about it, why do you think that is? Why do you think that you knew so little about it, prior to this journey that you've been on?
Because, well, so many reasons. One is that uh, it was never named except on little forms. I was raised in the 1960s. I was born in 1960, and this was an era where we were all supposed to be colorblind. We don't see color. We don't talk about color. We don't talk about race. It's rude. And so the whole thing was just um, pushed out of my view, even though it's all I'm getting. It's also the only thing in my view. And so it took a graduate school level course for me to wake up. And by the way, I was on diversity committees for 25 years, post college, pre really waking up in earnest, which didn't start till that graduate school course at age 48. I'm 60 now. So even on diversity committees, I, if someone had said, Debbie, how has whiteness impacted you? I wouldn't even have known how to make meaning of that. But I was there to help and fix, bring together communities, work on race relations, a term I no longer like.
Mentioning that your previous work on diversity committees, my sense of your book is that the audience, your kind of your ideal audience, if you will, if I can name it, that is, are I think a couple times in the book, I would say well-intended white people, right, who would say, "I'm not a racist," or "I don't see color,"
Mm-hmm.
right? And you're trying to get them to see it's not enough to say I'm not a racist, or it's not enough to say I don't. In fact, saying I don't see color is insufficient, right?
Is harmful.
It's hard. And in what ways? What have you come to learn about why that kind of phrasing is hurtful?
Well, we can't solve any problem in the universe if we don't talk about it. I mean, imagine being told that someone in your family has cancer, but we can't talk about it. We need to talk about issues. We need to understand their origins. We need to develop the language, the concepts. We need to think about understanding a problem so that we can better address intervening, dismantling, outgrowing, whatever language you want to use around whiteness. Yeah, I think that was huge. And this colorblind idea, this came out of the civil rights movement because the civil rights movement was trying to get away from Jim Crow laws that very specifically, you would look at a swimming pool or a toilet or a bench in a park and it would say colored or white. And so we're saying, no, 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 we're not going to do that. We're going to be race neutral. We're going to be colorblind. And that's ideology sort of leaked out into the general ideological atmosphere and got adopted as we don't talk, we don't see race. And of course that's impossible. And so at the very moment when the country decides to start integrating, we're told we can't talk about it. So integrating involves all kinds of issues. And if you can't talk about it as these issues are finally, we have a chance to work together, but we're told you can't talk about it. That's where so much was driven underground, and there's so much resentment
Mm.
in communities of color, and so much lack of awareness in white communities. It's just a toxic dynamic.
The way you describe it, and the language I've used also in having some conversations is I'd call reflexive habits of response. And I think you
Mm-hmm.
tackle some of those in your books, right? In terms of the way you were shaped and socialized, kind of shaped you in ways to have certain reflexive responses to issues involving race. And one of them, it seems to me, in terms of avoiding actual conversations with race, is to say, well, I don't see color, right? It's a way to kind of avoid the conversation by trying to suggest I've solved the problem for myself, so we don't need to have this conversation anymore.
Yes.
In what other ways have you seen these kinds of reflexive, socialized kind of reflexive responses on behalf of white people to being able to have these conversations about race?
Well, I think just sticking on the one that you offer is huge. We could actually take a really deep dive in there. So, um, I think it's people become defensive because if we don't see race, like, don't tell me you're seeing something racial in me because I don't even see race. And of course, we do see race. Um, it's a form of denial. Whether that's what it was intended to be or not, it's a form of denial. And what it does is it sets white people up to say, it's racist to talk about race. If you would stop talking about race, we'd all be fine. We'd all get over this thing. It's you talking about it that's the problem. Those are the kinds of problematic thinking that white people can get twisted up into. It also means if we don't talk about race, I don't have the vocabulary. And I also don't have the emotional stamina, because in addition to being told that talking about race was rude, I, especially as a white woman, was taught, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all, don't rock the boat. And you put all of that together, and I really grow up in a conflict avoidant culture, which means I have no conflict navigation skills. So now, if you really want to have an uncomfortable conversation about race, I can't even begin to do it. I am so afraid that if I say something wrong, my whole world will end, because what I don't understand is that there's this thing called skill. And when we mess up in conversation or and in our relationships, that we can work through it. That's just not something that I saw modeled for me, not just around race, but around anything.
It seems to me too and I resonate with that in terms of if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all. And it seems to me that um, growing up, being formed in that way, also blinds us. And I mentioned to you before we started talking the experience with my wife, right? My wife, who is Mexican. Early on, when we were dating, something happened where I said to her, where someone made a comment, I said to her, "Oh, just let it go." Because to me, that was a one-off, right? And I think it was I think about it now, hearing you say that, as an expression too of that, don't rock the boat, don't make waves. When for her, it was just another occasion in a long line of occasions where people had made similar kinds of comments. So when I hear you say that, it sounds like also that's another kind of avoidance mechanism. That kind of, if you don't have anything nice to say,
Mm-hmm.
way again for us to kind of opt out of having to have the conversation, right?
And your response in that moment is really typical. And, on the one hand, it's 100% authentic, because as far as you're concerned, things like this don't happen because
Mhm.
they don't happen to you.
Yeah.
Um, and yet, for the person of color, for the person who does experience it all the time, that kind of a reaction, which is potentially very authentic coming from you, is incredibly hurtful because it minimizes that experience. And it puts the person of color now possibly in the position of having to convince you that it is hurtful. And that, from my understanding of people of color, is exhausting to try to, and painful to try to, bear your trauma again and again to convince a friend or a family member this is real and it hurts
Mm-hmm.
and I want you to have my back.
Yes, and you mentioned the other kind of pattern, the pattern we might find ourselves in is, okay, I understand. I'm seeing something I didn't see before, and I think the temptation then again, talking about as I described, the well-intended white person who might be on this journey and now begins to see things. The a tendency I think would be, as you just described, now I'm going to turn to my friends of color and have them help me, or have them explain to me and help me make sense out of things, right? And as I've heard you just describe it, um, that's that just they're already exhausted from their experience that they've lived their lives with. Now you want you want me to be your tutor through
Right.
this journey, right? Is that something you experienced as you were kind of going through this journey?
I'm sure. Yeah, I definitely, and I actually learned pretty quickly. I remember saying to one of my friends, who's still a very good friend, if you ever see me do anything like really just messed up, like just tell me. And I remember we were sitting at a bar having beers together, and she took a big sip of her beer and she said, "Nope, I'm not taking on that role. You're going to have to figure that out."
Mm,
And, you know, I think she's reported later how um, empowering it felt for her to say that and not have me fall apart. And I can tell you inside a little bit, I was falling apart because I knew I had just stepped in my own stuff.
Hmm.
And I talked to, fortunately, I had some other, white ally friends, and I said, can I just share this conversation? It just made me feel sick to my stomach. And they're like, yeah, no, you can't ask person of color, to do that. And I think that was the moment where I really was like, okay, you have to surround yourself with white people who are on this journey. You need to Google, you need to read books, you need to do your work, Debbie.
Hmm. Absolutely.
Um,
You mentioned your response to your feeling bad about what had happened, right? What you had said or you learned from that experience. And I think you articulate in your book something again that's a very you mentioned my response in that occasion with my wife was probably one that was authentic for me at that point. I think another kind of authentic part of this journey is that when someone begins to take this seriously are the feelings of guilt,
yeah.
right? And you mentioned that how culpability overtook guilt in terms of this journey, and I hadn't thought of it until I read that part of your book. That I think guilt again is an authentic response as part of this journey,
Hmm.
but it can also become at some point another one of those avoidance mechanisms, right? Like we
Right.
feel guilty about what's going on, and that's where we stop with it, right? And again,
Right.
it can become another way of opting out of the conversation by feeling the guilt and then not knowing what to do with it. And
Hmm.
so, how did you work through that? Through that process of experiencing something we're all going to experience, but needing to take that next step, past the guilt,
Hmm.
um, towards a different way of thinking and operating and functioning in the future.
I think for me, because this happened in a course, every week there was no room for me to stay very long in my guilt, because every week I was being loaded with more horrific history. By the way, I was a history major.
Mm.
More horrific history. And so every week I had this experience of, how did I not know this? Like, how could I have one of the best educations money can buy. It seems I came out knowing so little, and I started to get madder and madder. So I think in my case, because of the pace I was learning, my guilt was overshadowed by anger at my country for lying to me. And anger is a much more productive emotion. Guilt can really, and shame can really get you caught in this, inertia.
Hmm.
And I did not have much inertia because I was so angry, and I really believed, like, I believe there are so many white people who we would all do so much better if we knew better. And so I pretty quickly translated my rage into action. And yet I meet people who get really caught in guilt. And uh, what I say is, none of us alive today invented this. We inherited it. And it is not our fault that we weren't taught the truth about our history, the truth about race not being biological, about it being a political tool. Um, and yet, once we do know something about it, then I think there is a responsibility.
That's what I was thinking. But my thinking through this has been, for me, it's about responsibility, right?
Hmm.
Having learned what I've learned or experienced what I've experienced or tried to hear things I've maybe not wanted to hear, right? And relative to how I viewed the world, that the next step for me is responsibility, um, and not be tempted by stopping at some point.
Hmm.
Stopping it either the guilt or stopping it either wanting to self-justify, right? Again, the I don't see race or I don't see color, stop there with it. But listening means taking on a responsibility. And this was part of the conversation I had with my guest last night, which was, we were talking about exchanges with people and his how he addresses he's African American, how he addresses sometimes something that someone might say, and the exchange and how that exchange might transpire. And there are different ways it can happen, right? That he could say to someone, I'd say, hey, look, oh, we were talking about what we would call today microaggressions. Someone might say something again that's they think they're expressing something. It's what they know. Person of color hears and says, hey, I just want to let you know what I hear when you say this, and the different kinds of responses that can transpire from that. One of them can be a guilt that puts the person in that person of color now in the position of having to comfort that person, right? Another can be a oh my I didn't realize it, thank you, and trying to move those steps forward. And in our conversation, I said, what I understand as the responsible movement forward then is the next time something like that happens, when somebody might say something like that, that I now recognize responsibility is now I need to step in and say, hey, do you know how that sounds? Right?
Right.
Instead of saying, oh, okay, well, I heard it again, but I know he'll take care of it because he took care of it before. Right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
so how do you how in talking in talking to the audiences that you speak with, um, how do you help them um, be attentive to the way that conversations might take place or transpire, um, the habits of listening? How do you help them develop the habits of listening so there isn't that defensiveness, which again I know you've experienced. You talked about your experience at that conference where you stood up, asked a question you thought was a question, right? And someone said you had responses back, and you acknowledge you're immediately defensive. Inside. You're immediately getting defensive. I imagine that's a very common experience again for people. So how do you help people kind of acknowledge that defensiveness and kind of work through that defensiveness?
Well, part of it is building that emotional capacity, building the capacity to, now this is disrupting whiteness. Whiteness wants us to believe that we're supposed to be perfect. And so we need to acknowledge, like, we're all human. Of course, we make mistakes. So I need to kind of adopt that mindset, and I need to be okay with being uncomfortable because it is embarrassing to get called out. That still hasn't stopped for me. I get called out in front of hundreds and thousands of people now, and it still doesn't feel good. And yet I've developed the capacity to say, oh, dang, I've done it again. And thank you. Thank you so much for the feedback. I'm going to think long and hard about that. Role playing is the answer to how we work on it. Do a lot of role playing where we practice, in white spaces where people of color don't have to see all of our messiness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think understanding the dynamics. I mean, this is what white fragility, Robin DiAngelo's book, is all about: is what our fragility, how it acts like a glass ceiling on the kinds of conversations and relationships we're able to have in racially mixed spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's also really important to know why. Why, as a white person, do I care? And I've been on a big journey around that. When I was younger, in my 20s, I was kind of in that white savior mindset. I'm going to help and fix people who actually down deep I believe are inferior. And then I finally realized race isn't real, and but this isn't fair for people of color, so I'm going to fight. And now I'm in a very different place, which is I am fighting for the world I want to live in. I don't want to live in a world that's a caste system, because all of the attitudes and behaviors, the cultural norms that we have to adopt to hold in place a caste system, they're all dehumanizing. They hurt us. They infect all of our relationships, I think. Again, with ideas that we should always be in a hurry, we should always be busy, we're supposed to be perfect, there's a right and a wrong way. And so there is a much more humane way to live. And by the way, I just think it's so ironic that so many people think Black Lives Matter is a violent, angry organization, because the reason Black Lives Matter folks are angry is because the beautiful, humane world that they so want to create. This is that beloved community that Dr. Martin Luther King described. Um, that world cannot happen when whiteness is centered, when caste system and hierarchy and power and profit are really what drives the country.
You mentioned Black Lives Matter. It seems to me that's one of those areas where there is both the opportunity and the responsibility for white people as they make this journey to step in with some kind of response to their white friends, right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, instead of relying on any African American, Latino friends they might have to respond to. And by that I mean either um, I like the idea of Black Lives Matter, except for, or if only they,
Right.
or or all lives matter, right? So
This is my go-to recommendation for people who want to better understand Black Lives Matter. This is the memoir of one of the three founders,
mm,
and it says everything you need to know to really understand what the spirit and the roots of the Black Lives Matter movement are about. Just how steeped in love and humanity the movement is.
I think one of the things you point out in your book, as far as part of your coming to understand this world better, not the world you grew up in, the wider world better, is one of the you write about the election of Barack Obama, right? And some people's responses, which were, well, if he gets elected, then black people are going to want to you know uh, um, oppress us, right? And you
It's
found,
payback time.
yeah, it's payback time. And you write that you found in all your interactions with people you knew that was never the feeling, correct?
No. It's this beautiful, humane. I mean, I feel like in many ways, the but there are always subgroups, but the dominant Black community in the United States that has come out of enslaved Africa and Africans, as opposed to people who moved here from Nigeria a year ago or 10 years ago. Um, this is a strong statement, and I believe it to the depths of my soul. They're trying to save white people. I mean, they're really trying to save us all from this dehumanization. It hurts all of us. And, if you read the works of James Baldwin, he's so desperately trying to help white people see you have bought into a myth. You have bought into a fantasy, and it does none of us good. When you said that you had the thesis, I like the sentence you pulled out as the thesis. I think another one I have in there that I like a lot is a line that says something like, white people, racism allows white people to believe that they're superior, and it allows people of color to actually believe they're inferior, and neither of those two things are true. And that crushes spirits. Um, and when humanity is at its best, and we all know this from our closest relationships, we're not operating in a power struggle. We're operating as separate but entwined, interconnected individuals.
Mm-hmm. You write that part of this journey is your own coming to terms then with your own upbringing, what you knew and did not know in your upbringing, and reflecting on your parents, your family, asking questions, both kind of, I think, struggling with both your childhood, which you describe as I would say a great childhood. I had a great childhood, right? I love the way my parents raised me, but I also see things now in terms of the comfort of that childhood, right? That you describe very well in the book. And at one point in the book, you write about the kind of tension between I love my family, I love my parents, I love the people that I know, the community I know growing up, and I have this new community that I'm forming with other people, and you're trying to kind of make sense out of the tension between those two. And how did you do that, or is that still a work in progress?
I wouldn't put that in the past tense.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very much an ongoing journey. And I'll tell you something that I hear from audiences all over the country is that people really do lose friendships. White people really do lose friends and family by taking a stand. Um, and and what I would say about my own friends and family is that I could not have predicted who would have kind of started waking up with me, who would have been supportive of me, and who would have iced me out. or resisted any kind of conversations I tried to have. I was so surprised by who fell into each of those camps. Um, and and I will also tell you, what is amazing is that one family member who was the most challenging, he unfriended me on Facebook 5 years ago, has refriended me recently and said, I owe you an apology. I really didn't get it. And I had heard from people of color and white people all along, just say it. You don't know how people will receive it, and you don't know when they'll receive it. That if you don't say anything, when you see an opportunity to say something, you're colluding with whiteness.
It seems to be again those, it's interesting to hear you say that. Like I might get to that point of recognizing my reflexive response in just having conversations about race and moving past, moving through that, like not past, I should say, but through that, right? To recognize that response and want to move forward on that. But there are other types of reflexive responses along the way that we should be aware of. And one of them might be, yes, that moment where responsibility means speaking out and speaking out in ways that might result in, like I said, friends, people unfriending you on Facebook, family members not talking to you, or friends not talking to you again, or for a period of time, right? It seems to me that's another kind of potentially reflexive response that's part of that. We might have recognized, don't say anything unless you be nice as not helpful here, and think we've solved the problem, but it keeps rearing itself. It sounds like
Right,
along the way,
right.
right?
Yeah. It's like not going to the doctor when you have symptoms that keep coming back.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, and I don't want to give the idea that just keep, doing this,
Yeah.
because there's actually a lot of skill and nuance. Really using our intuition to say, is this the right time? Is this the right conversation? Is it my fear, my white conditioning that's telling me not to, or would this really be a bad idea to do this now? It's always okay if you flub up a conversation to say, you know what, a week or a month later, that conversation we had that didn't go so well. I would love a retry on that. It
Mm-hmm.
just didn't sit well with me. I love you. I love our friendship, and I'd love a retry. And in that time, you have thought more. Maybe you've role played with some friends, and you figured out another try. And so to just keep going at it, and always remind the people in your life who you love that you love them, and that's why you're saying this.
Mm-hmm. And it's that desire to try to continue to be in relationship with people you love. It raises for me another kind of interesting take you have on your book, and that's on the matter of tolerance, right? That we often want to define tolerance as just simply letting things be, right? It seems like it can be another form of the don't say anything unless you can be nice. If we just let things be, but you have a very different take on how we should be thinking about tolerance, and describe how you have come to understand how you approach the issue of tolerance.
Well, I never liked that word. So in the 90s and the early 2000s, I would often see in, school literature and places like, we believe in tolerance. In fact, there's a magazine called Teaching Tolerance, which is actually excellent. But tolerance is setting the bar so low. Think about the last time you tolerated someone. For me, it's my husband on a bad day after a big fight, but pandemic, we have to stay in the same house. I will tolerate him. That's not a good place to be. And so I don't like the word tolerance. I have come to realize that if there's a place for that word in this work, it's me learning to tolerate myself. It's me tolerating my own feelings until I can learn to grow them. It's me tolerating that voice, that almost childish voice that says, I didn't mean it that way, or why should I have to, or this is too hard, and starting to have to tolerate my own limitations so that I don't act them out, and so that I can use them instead to grow myself into a more expansive version of myself. I mean, for me, that's what this whole thing is about. It's about human potential, mine, yours, ours. And there's no way potential can grow in an environment that is designed to make us small, to dehumanize us.
Mhm. You know, and that former version of tolerance you described is one whereby you can be in the same room with somebody, you don't have to engage with them, right? You don't have to listen to them. You don't have to, you can just simply be and not have to worry about anything beyond that, right? And that's, yeah, that's it, tolerance for ourselves, though, is a very different kind. Even tolerance for our mistakes
Mm-hmm.
as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's been a recurring kind of thing. I think
Oh, that's interesting.
we've been talking about here is, you mentioned it. My conversation yesterday was about it too. We have to accept that we're going to make mistakes, and that's okay, right? They can't. The fear of the mistakes can't be the reason why we don't take that step,
Mm-hmm.
right? And take the risk of saying something or wanting to say something simply out of fear, correct?
Mm-hmm. And I don't think many white people have models of what it looks like
Mm,
to mess up and recover.
mm,
And so I think, I mean, that was one of the reasons I chose to make myself so vulnerable in that book in Waking Up White, because I felt that it was the book, I wrote the book I wish someone had handed me.
mm.
And what I wish someone had shown me is what it looks like to say, wow, I just really messed up. I feel terrible, and I'm not going to let it stop me.
I'm sure a response you have very likely received from some people would be, well, now she hates America, right? She's been on this journey. Now she hates America. She hates her culture. She hates, she hates Western civilization. What has been your response to those kinds of, I don't even think they're criticism. I call them attacks, really.
Yeah. Um, my response is, not only do I not hate my country, I would not be dedicating my life to racial justice if I didn't love my country. I am doing this. I'm fighting for the country I was told that I lived in. I was told that I lived in the sweet land of liberty. And that's what I'm fighting for. And I as a human being, I have so many moments in my life where I've set a goal for myself and I've fallen short. And what I know is, to get closer to my goal, I have to be honest about where and why I've fallen short so I can get a little bit closer on my next try. And when I'm talking about, I wish I'd known this history, I wish I'd known the ways we were falling short, it's not because I want to trash my country. It's because I want to understand so I can get closer and closer and closer to that promise of freedom that I'm just never going to let go of to my dying day. So that's what I'm fighting for, and I'm doing it because I love myself and I love all of my fellow human beings, and I love this country and the idea that this country puts out to the rest of the world. Let's make it real.
Mhm. And it sounds like in your description of that, that many of the ideals you may have grown up with, you still have. They've just been reframed.
Exactly.
They give a different kind of focus, right? So again, it's
Hmm.
not so much that going through this journey means giving up something as it means perhaps those things that you valued take a different kind of focus, a different kind of meaning, a different kind of value, right? That is more expansive perhaps than what you thought you knew at some point in your life.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think it's also about, I want to equip myself to live into my values. I wasn't living into my values
Mm.
because I didn't have enough information to do that. And I didn't even know I wasn't living into my values. But now every day I know a little bit more about how to live in to my values.
I like that last phrase in there, every day. I think that
Hmm.
an important part of this isn't a checkbox of things, right? It's
Hmm.
not going to be 20 things that I'm able to check off and say, okay, I've attained my certificate in knowing that I'm white, right? So that I can do this. This is a lifelong journey,
Hmm.
right, toward these ideals um, that we hold to be true, coming to understand them in a different and new light. but nevertheless, it's always a work in progress, correct?
Always. And we are works in progress. That's another piece of what it means to be human.
Mhm.
That's why we're not
Absolutely.
perfect.
Absolutely. So you mentioned in your own journey it was a matter of a lot of reading, um, to try to understand this history that you were not told or did not study when you were growing up. Are there any either books or are there organizations that you have read or worked with that you have found to be particularly in terms of people who are kind of on this, as I said, on this journey? They're discovering the things they didn't know, right?
Hmm.
And they're taking those steps. Are there any books, organizations you could recommend that people might either read or turn to as kind of to help them as part of that journey?
Yeah, there's so many resources. And do you send out a resource list at all ever after one of these? Do you know who's attended or?
These live streams, I do not know who's attended, but certainly for the community, yes.
Yeah.
I think a resource list would be that's a very helpful suggestion.
Yeah. And so I think one of the tools that I would like to share with you is something called the 21-day Racial Equity Habit Building Challenge.
Mm.
And for 20, there are two different ways to go about it, and I can send you both options. One is kind of spoon fed to you every single day. You sign up and something. You get a little challenge every day that lands in your either text or email. You choose, and it might be reading an article. It might be having a certain kind of a conversation with somebody. It might be watching a short video. And the other one is we have a long list of resources, and you go in and you pick every day for 21 days what you want to take on as your resource, your challenge. Um, and in the second version that I just mentioned, we have lots of organizations to connect to. That's one of the choices. Today, connect with a new organization, which means sign up for their newsletter, like their social media. Um, so so that's what I would say. I mean, my website is a rabbit hole of resources.
Mm.
So DebbyIrving.com. Debbie's with a Y, Irving's with an I. I'll send you the 221-day challenges. I think, there's a annual conference, which of course isn't happening until we're out of this pandemic, but the White Privilege Conference
Mhm.
has been a really extraordinary place for me to learn. And also, there is a group here in Cambridge that's been going on for Cambridge, Mass. That's where I am. Has been going on for 22 years called White People Challenging Racism, Moving from Talk to Action. And it's a 5-week course run by volunteers.
Mm.
And after if you take the course a few times, you might be asked to be one of those volunteers.
Mm.
And so it's just, it's an amazing 5-week curriculum. It's sort of 2 hours every Monday night or 2 hours every Wednesday night for 5 weeks. And it's a combination of, reading and watching videos. So the educational piece. The second of the three components is role playing, learning to speak, um, learning to be spoken to. And the third piece is an action plan.
Mm.
And some people's action plans are, I want to start a reading group that for the next 2 years reads, a different book every 6 weeks about racism. Or I want to start a diversity committee at my school. Or, I want to change the mascot on my child's high school. So an action plan can be anything, but there's a really great sort of rubric, a protocol that you go through to develop your action plan. So I think it's important we can't just do one thing, we can't just read books. We actually
Mm.
have to engage. And so I think it's important for white people to have both white circles, white people that we're in touch with, and also find our way eventually, after we've done some learning, into racially mixed groups. And it doesn't have to be a book that talks about racism. I mean, a group that talks about racism. It might be a cross-country ski club or a fishing club. It doesn't have to be like the only thing that we do with people of color shouldn't be talk about racism.
Mhm. That's a very good point. I think also
Hmm.
another kind of trap we could fall in our earnestness, our eagerness,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Our eagerness to have discovered this, to be on this this path of learning again would be yes to only want to talk about racism with
Right.
another, right? Again, and it creates that scenario again of on their part, listening to us saying, yes, I know, yes, I know, yes, I know.
Right.
They putting him in the position again to have to be our tutor, right, or our listening buddy
Or
as we go.
hearing our ahas.
Yes, here are ahas as we go through this. Yes. One one last question for you, and that is, with what has transpired over the summer, we've seen also this desire on the part of many institutions to be serious, right, about systemic racism, where it may trying to examine where it might be operating in their institutions, addressing it, and I'm sure that you have worked with organizations, and our own organization here are taking those steps. And I think we're at a stage of kind of trying to figure out what we don't know that we don't know, to try to take those steps forward. And is there kind of either one bit of advice you'd give, or is there a pitfall that you have noticed in organizations that we or other organizations should be aware of as we're in these kind of nascent stages of wanting to try to move forward on taking seriously systemic racism, not just as an out there thing, but an inside here thing?
I wish I could remember the saying that, like, if you're going to paint a room, I think like 80% of the time is preparing the room, and 20% of the time is actually painting. I feel like there's a similar formula. Like, spend a lot of time understanding the issue. Um, and in trying to understand the issue, a group of white people, or predominantly white people, the same old people who missed it for the last century, are not going to be the group sitting around the table that's going to figure it out. So there needs to be a way to bring in multiple perspectives whose voices are not at the table. And there can be so much mistrust from people who are from historically marginalized groups being invited to the big table, that you're not going to get open, easy conversation. And so it's more likely to start to get some of that perspective through surveys, through small groups, through RAs having sending out sets of questions to RAs, um, and to understand that if you start slowly and you do it carefully, that the momentum will build. And ultimately, what you want is, you want a diverse group of people understanding the issue and designing your way out of it.
Mm. I think that's very helpful advice to end our conversation. We're right at just about an hour. So, Debby Irving, thank you for making your time available to us. I recommend to everyone to read her book, Waking Up White, especially not just for the chronicle of your journey, but the questions you ask, I think, are very helpful at the end of each chapter to get your reader to kind of bring themselves into not only the conversation, but into the experience. So I'm thank you for all the work that you are doing, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me to Maine. Wish I could have been there in person.
Yeah.